us on a mission as a search committee to find a new church. But we had to find a church that would be willing to accept a whole congregation of gays and their allies. And we did find a couple of churches, and Father John came to talk to us, and the rest, as they say, is history. We found a beautiful new home with a pastor who met and accepted us with love, but he had one condition. He wanted us to really become a part of the parish, to belong, to have a home, and to really join in everything we could in a parish, in an entire parish. If you look at your handouts, you will see that we definitely responded. We are here and here to stay in a community that has welcomed us with open arms. And Father John is our pastor, the English teacher, the landscaper, the preacher, the one who holds out his hands to welcome all. He has our backs and leads by example. He teaches us how to connect with God and makes the readings and the Gospels relevant and alive to us in the world today. FJ, as we call him, is not judgmental, and through him we learn how Jesus wants us to live our lives. He is the heart and the soul of this thriving community known as Saint Cecilia's. It's my honor to introduce our pastor extraordinaire, Father John Uni.
Hi, everyone. I'm FJ, that's Father John, and that's better than FU, Father Uni. Mellon, you were and are very gracious and generous in all you said, and as I'm listening to it, it's very humbling, and it's uncomfortable to hear that. I feel like I've not done any of that enough, but it is us as a community. This is a very welcoming community, and the fact that we're all here this evening and all those who are joining with us virtually this evening, it's just really good for us to be together as community in this way. Michael and Terry, I want to welcome you guys in your roles this evening. Michael was saying back in 2014, when you were here in Boston, you were here, and you said I didn't talk too long back then, but it's worsened as the years have gone on. So, please allow me to introduce Father Terry Deveneaux, our Jesuit friend. We're so blessed with the Jesuits here in our parish, and Father Peter Grover over at St. Clement. And Terry will be the facilitator of tonight's discussion. Terry went to Worcester State, got his MDiv at Seton Hall, and has served in many roles as a Jesuit here in the East Coast province of the Society of Jesus. That was a little redundant, so but he's one of these wicked smart guys, these Jesuits, huh? He was at Scranton, Fairfield, BC, Eastern Point Retreat House. He's been Catholic chaplain at Brigham and Women's, and he is now in chaplaincy at Emmanuel College, serving as Vice President of Mission and Ministry. He oversees many various works at the Cardinal Sean O'Malley Center for Mission and Ministry, as well as being the chaplain at Emmanuel and here at Saint Cecilia. Terry was also at the Jesuit Urban Center for a few years, serving the LGBTQ community there. He was spiritual director, and he is very welcoming and embracing of every single child of God with great love and acceptance. And then Michael O'Loughlin. St. Anselm, I went to St. Mike's. I went a little further north, but then I didn't go to Yale afterwards, huh? Look at that. Religion and theology, got his master's there. Michael's a journalist, author, commentator, and speaker who covers religion and politics with a particular focus on the Catholic Church. He's a former staff writer for the Boston Globe and its Catholic site, Crux. Michael's national correspondent for America, the Jesuit Review. He also writes for the National Catholic Reporter, the NCR, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and many others. Pope Francis himself read Hidden Mercy and sent Michael a letter thanking him for his research into the Catholic response to the HIV/AIDS crisis back in the 80s and 90s. So that seems to be a rousing endorsement there. He is a New Englander now living in Chicago. So Michael, we're very graced, blessed, and grateful to have you here this evening. So thank you. Terry?
Thank you. Thanks, John. You know, back in 2007, I was at the University of Scranton, and I found out the Urban Center was closing, and I came home, it was during the summer, to have the opportunity to be at the closing Mass of the Jesuit Urban Center. And the place was filled, and there was a lot of emotion. And I remember through the entire liturgy really praying, God, what's going to happen to these people? Where will they find a home, or will they find a home, or what? And at communion, I felt very strongly about this desire to pray to God that they find their way. Well, after communion and after the closing prayer, a young pastor came up and stood up at the altar, and it was an answer to many, many, many people's prayers, John. And I remember sitting there, and I'm like thinking, I should pray more, you know, that God heard my prayers. But that I just remember that day vividly. And so since then, the people, Michael, the people from the Harrison Avenue, from the Jesuit Urban Center, found home and have been very much a part of this ministry and really woven into this community and continue to do very good work of welcoming others and allowing people to feel very much a part of the community, but to feel very much whole and holy. And so it's good to be here. Your book, Michael, has received great acclaim, and as John says, you know, from the Holy Father and to lots of people reading about it and hearing about what you've done. I remember a few years ago reading as you started this. I read something in the America magazine. So I kind of boldly I wrote to you and said, "Can we have coffee?" You know, and so there's no coffee here. There's water, and it took a few years for this to happen. But I guess as we come together tonight, and for everyone here and those who will be with us over live stream, and it's being recorded as well, why this book? And why now? You know, the 80s and the 90s in some ways seem so long ago, and yet for some of us it seems not that far. So why now, and why the book?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for your willingness to be part of this tonight. And thank you all for being here. I know there's a lot of options on how you can spend your time on a Tuesday evening, so I appreciate you taking some time here, both in person and online. As Father John said, when I moved to Boston back in 2014 for a few months, I was asking around, where should I go to church? And almost unanimously, it was Saint Cecilia's. And I came here many times and felt warmly welcome, so it's wonderful to be welcomed back by the Rainbow Ministry and the organizers who helped put this on tonight. So thank you all for being part of this. I had a chance to chat with some folks as they were coming in, and I know there's a long history of the church's response to HIV and AIDS here in Boston, so I hope we'll be able to share some stories tonight, and I'll be out back afterward and would love to learn more about what brought you tonight and how you had been involved previously. So to answer your question, why this book and why now? When I began reporting full-time back in 2013, 2014, my job was to write about the Catholic Church in the United States. What were bishops saying about various issues? What were Catholics in the pews thinking? What was going on? And at the time, there was a real debate about the rights of LGBT people in society. There were debates about marriage, about civil rights protections, and I was charged with writing about those because that's what the conversation was. And I was able to do so because that was what was in the news, but personally it meant a lot for me because as a gay man in the church, I wasn't really sure of my place, if I had a place in the church. So kind of throwing myself into the reporting was a way to sort of explore those questions from a personal angle while not putting myself out there too much. And I did that for a number of years, but it wasn't totally satisfying. I wasn't getting the kinds of answers or having the kind of conversations I craved. So I was chatting with a priest friend one night, as people do, over dinner, and kind of unloading all this on him, telling him about my challenges, and telling him that I felt kind of alone and isolated, like I was the first person to be going through this, trying to reconcile my identity as a gay person and my identity as a Catholic. And he told me a story, and he said that he had been a young priest in the early 1990s working on a college campus in Toronto when he heard that HIV and AIDS was affecting the campus community. Students, faculty were affected either personally or they had friends and family who were, and they felt like they didn't have a place to meet. So he offered them the use of the Catholic Student Center, and they formed a support group and met each week, and it grew and became a successful, thriving ministry. His bishop found out about it and was not happy. He thought it was sort of the church lending support to the gay rights community, the gay activist community, and asked him to shut it down. He refused and said no, that he wanted to respond to this great need out in the community. And I was really struck by that there was this part of my friend's ministry I knew nothing about, even though I knew him pretty well, and that it was an example of a Catholic priest standing with the gay community. And I thought, how strange, I don't know any of this history. So he encouraged me to explore this time in history, maybe learn more of it. So I spent the next 5 years reaching out to people who were active in HIV and AIDS care in the 80s and 90s, whether from a ministry perspective, a healthcare perspective in Catholic hospitals, and learning that there was this robust response from the church, often away from the limelight. But as a result, it gave me comfort knowing that I wasn't alone in this, that people before me had come to stand with LGBT people, that there was a place in the church for us. So that's how the book came to be.
Wow. You know, in reading the book, and for those who haven't read the book, I mean, there's a time period that you pay particular attention to, and that would be the 80s and the 90s. And, you know, much to what you're sharing about this priest in Toronto, that there wasn't a robust response. It was really just the opposite. So why the 80s and 90s? I mean, could you say a little bit about that, especially for those here that maybe have read it?
Yeah, so as someone born in the mid-1980s, this was all kind of new to me. It was history that we never quite got to in high school. We kind of always stopped in the 60s or 70s, and that more recent history I just didn't know much about. So as I started researching and learning more about the HIV and AIDS crisis, I was really struck by just the intense amount of shame and stigma that accompanied an HIV diagnosis in the 80s and 90s. And one statistic has stuck with me, a Pew Research poll from 1987, in which 43% of Americans said that they agreed with the statement that HIV and AIDS might be a punishment from God for people leading an immoral lifestyle. So you had 43% of Americans not only believing that, but were willing to admit that to a pollster. So that kind of attitude was probably even much higher than that poll suggests. And as I started researching that time more, all these different data points that had existed in my mind started to take on new meaning. So I had known that the Catholic Church as an institution had cracked down on LGBT groups in the 1980s. So you had groups like Dignity were being kicked out of parishes around the country. I knew that Catholic bishops were fighting against civil rights bills in Boston, New York, San Francisco, places throughout the Midwest, which was particularly troubling because at the time there were very little protections for LGBT people. So you could be kicked out of your housing, you could be fired from a job, you could be kicked off your insurance if your insurance company found out you had HIV. So in my mind, I had known about some of these things just through my interest in church history and church politics. But then when I realized that this was all happening against the backdrop of HIV, I realized that this was an incredibly tense time for LGBT Catholics who felt, I think, torn between their affection for the church and their devotion to their faith and the gay rights, the gay activist community that was really targeting the church because of its involvement in political matters. So I was struck by that tense situation that LGBT Catholics felt at the time and wanted to learn how they made it work. It kind of made my own struggles feel a bit more manageable, given the reality that LGBT people have found a lot of societal acceptance today. So by kind of forging those friendships, those intergenerational friendships, and just asking how did you do it, I found a number of models and really role models for me of people who have stuck with it and made life as an LGBT person in the church work.
Great segue. I was thinking in the book there's so many different characters. There's different people that you selected, I'm sure, out of the many that you interviewed along the way. I mean, we all have some of those heroes and heroines in our, in our own area here in Boston. Sister Zita Fleming or Father John Fuller or different people. Mm-hmm. But in the book, like you selected certain people. Why those characters?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was fortunate to be able, Father John Fuller, who headed the National Catholic AIDS Network for a number of years, was a great help in the book. A number of individuals from Boston I interviewed. They provided good insight and commentary and background. For me, I wanted to interview people, so they had to be still alive and willing to share their story. That was one criteria, which is a challenge for a book that is covering HIV and AIDS because we lost so many people at the time. So many stories I was not able to capture, which was a real challenge for me. But I wanted to interview different kinds of people who approach this question from different perspectives. So in the book, one of the main characters is a Catholic sister, Sister Carol Baltashevitz, who was a home care nurse in southern Illinois. So she was visiting patients in their homes when she started to see now and then young men who had moved from their small towns, usually to the coasts, and then returned home. And when they returned home, they had to tell their parents three things: that they were gay, that they had AIDS, and that they were dying. And it was a pattern she saw play out a couple times, and she grew frustrated because she didn't know how to respond. She was kind of a tough nurse who made her way up through the ICU and ER before moving to home care, and she was used to solving problems. But this was a problem she couldn't solve because there wasn't much medically she could do, and she was really frustrated with that. So instead of just kind of throwing up her hands, she decided that she would seek out resources and figure out, what is it I can do? Can I be a social worker? Can I be someone who's a liaison between the medical community and the family? And ultimately, she decided that there just wasn't enough in her part of the world to learn what she needed to. So she and another sister from her order packed up and moved to New York, where they threw themselves into HIV and AIDS care. There was a fairly robust Catholic response at the time. So she was volunteering at Catholic hospitals. She was answering calls on an AIDS hotline. She was going to gay bars with some gay Catholic friends and learning about this community she had previously had no contact with. And ultimately learns that there is the potential to help, the pastoral care angle, the being present with people when they feel abandoned by their family, even connecting with doctors who are willing to take care of people with HIV and AIDS. And she moves home and opens an AIDS resource center, which becomes really the biggest provider of HIV and AIDS care in that part of Illinois, and becomes an advocate for people with HIV and AIDS. And I included her not because of that story necessarily. Like, it's a good temptation to view this nurse as sort of a hero nurse nun who responds to a community in need, and she was. But what I found most interesting about Sister Carol's story was she told me that her interaction with the LGBT community transformed her. So it wasn't just her giving back to a community in need. It helped her understand the gospel in a new way. It showed her a kind of love she hadn't been exposed to before, that she hadn't thought about before. And she said it made her a better Christian, made her a better Catholic. So I thought that was interesting, where she's the protagonist in her story, but at the same time, her faith is shaped by her interaction with this community. And I thought that might be a good example for Christians, for Catholics today, who are maybe unsure about how to interact with a community that might not be familiar to them.
Right. As you say, pastoral care, I mean, I was around in those days. I was younger than John, but I mean, I was very young in those days. But my brother died of AIDS in 1990, and I just remember at the time, my mother was inconsolable, and my dad couldn't talk about it, and And there was just so many people in our area where I lived that were dying, and the pastoral piece became almost an overwhelming question. Like, where do we go? What do we do? Who do we reach out to? And so, can you say a little bit about that piece of pastoral care, based on the folks that you talk about in the book?
I think something that struck me when researching the book was just how young many of the people affected by HIV and AIDS in the early years were. Mostly gay men in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and in addition to the physical suffering, the loneliness that accompanied it, forced to confront questions of mortality that I think most people think they'll have a few decades before they have to deal with that kind of thing. And suddenly you're being forced to think about these issues. And a lot of people turn to their faith when they're thinking about life and death. And at the time, so many people either had been sort of shunned by their faith communities, or at least didn't feel welcome, didn't feel like they had a space to go talk to a priest or a sister about some of these existential questions. And that struck me as particularly tragic, that at this moment when there might be a spiritual resource available, it just wasn't there for people. And so that's why I find the stories like Sister Carol, Father Bill, other priests and sisters who stepped up and simply visited people in the hospital, listened, offered to be a consoling presence, held someone's hand at a time when many people were afraid to touch. That struck me as particularly heroic because there were so few people willing to respond. And there was a fairly robust, if sometimes underground, pastoral response among Catholics. Here in Boston, certainly around the country, different networks of care providers who were willing to, I think sometimes even at great risk to their own reputations, engage with the community in need and be that pastoral presence when many people refused.
You just kind of slid his name in there, but you mentioned Bill, and I'm assuming that's Bill McNichols. And with that lack of opportunities for people really, and almost like underground, as you said, there were other ways that seemed to be coming forward, and whether it was in music, or it was in art, or it was in liturgy. Can you say a little bit about Father McNichols and like how that experience that he had in the lives of others in New York and all made a difference throughout the country, really?
Yeah, so one of the main characters, one of the people I profile in the book, Father William Hart McNichols, was a young Jesuit priest in the 1980s. He had moved to New York to pursue art graduate work, and he was drawn into HIV and AIDS care. It wasn't something he sought out, but he had been involved with Dignity, the LGBT Catholic group. They had asked him to celebrate a Mass for people with AIDS, and he said that at that first Mass, he realized that this was going to be his ministry, that the need for pastoral care was so great in the community. And it was interesting where he became totally immersed in HIV and AIDS care. He kind of helped pioneer the Catholic response, working at St. Vincent's and St. Clair's, visiting people in their homes, visiting hospitals. But he didn't give up on his art. It was sort of an interesting journey for me to realize that he continued producing art that spoke to people with AIDS. He produced art as an activist to kind of hold up a mirror so society could see how they were discriminating against people with AIDS through things like depicting Christ covered in KS lesions, a physical symptom of HIV and AIDS. And it was interesting, he created Stations of the Cross, a version of the Stations of the Cross specifically about people with HIV and AIDS, and each station sort of mirrors a different development that someone with AIDS might be experiencing, like rejection from their family, physical suffering, eventually through death and resurrection. And these were used at different kinds of vigils and services throughout the country. And I wrote about one that happened in Fordham University in New York in the 1980s. During Lent, there was this candlelight vigil where these particular version of the Stations was being used. And in the book, I wrote about it from the perspective of someone who was there. I interviewed people who attended this and how it was a powerful way to remind people of the suffering that happened behind closed doors. But at an event a few weeks ago at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut, at the end during the question and answer portion, someone stood up and said he had a comment more than a question, which can be a scary thing. But he continued and said that he had just finished the book, and it was difficult for him to read that section that comes at the end because he had been a freshman at Fordham and remembers that specific vigil, and he had desperately wanted to go, but he was so closeted and so ashamed, he said he wasn't willing to risk someone seeing him there, and that he was so afraid that even looking out his dorm window at the vigil outside, he was afraid someone would look up and see him looking out, so he kind of backed away and didn't look at all. So he was moved to learn decades later what had actually happened at the vigil, and felt a little more connected to sort of the activism back then. So these powerful examples of Catholic imagination sort of helping people understand better the suffering that was happening, Father Bill devoted his early ministry to.
Yeah, I was moved in the book when you talk about Bill in different ways, but even his own commitment to a relationship with the saints. And so Aloysius Gonzaga, I'm just wondering, do you have the medal on?
I do, yeah.
And so that commitment really is one of the church's really a call to the church, that the church calls out to the people of God, a care and commitment of mercy. And then even, the title of the book, Hidden Mercy. So can you speak a little bit to the commitment of the church to mercy and to healing?
Yeah, it was an interesting realization for me. So I spoke a little bit earlier about the context. So you did have sort of an institutional-wide maybe failure to respond, or at least this public perception that the church was fighting against LGBT rights at the time. A lot of discrimination was being perpetuated by some church leaders, also some ordinary Catholics. There's a story in the book about a group of Catholic parents who kind of revolted against their pastor when they learned he was planning to use some parish property as an AIDS hospice. They threatened to withdraw their children from the Catholic school. So that is an important piece of the history, and I don't try to erase that, even though I tend to focus on the more hopeful stories. And what I found interesting was there was this response to the gospel, response to church teaching that motivated some of that, but at the same time, it motivated people like Sister Carol and Father Bill and nurses working at Catholic hospitals, physicians working to serve people with HIV and AIDS. So there's this dichotomy in our faith that does seem to inspire people to act in different ways, all coming from the same text and the same faith tradition. But at the same time, there does seem to be this commitment to serving the marginalized, to serving communities in need. And those were the stories I wanted to focus on, because I sometimes joke at talks that I don't think it's easy for anyone to be Catholic. Like, there's going to be a statement or a situation where you feel alienated or unwelcome. For me, it's sometimes the LGBT issues, but everyone has some kind of experience, I think, with the church that kind of pushes them away at one time or another. But I hope that in these stories, people take away that there is this other side of our faith that is radically hospitable and radically welcoming, that is where Jesus would be. So I hope that in these stories, people do feel like there's a place in the church for them, no matter your situation.
Did you encounter any disconnects between the priorities of those who are our shepherds, our hierarchy, and what was happening on the ground floor in Catholic spaces?
Yes, I did. The stories in the book, like I said, tend to be the Catholics doing the really difficult work in the trenches of serving people in need. And I'm thinking of people like David Pace, who I write about. He is a Catholic who lives in New York, and in the 1980s, he and his partner were diagnosed with HIV. His partner died from AIDS-related complications a couple of years later. But rather than sort of walk away, David throws himself into ministry. How can he serve other people with HIV? How can he be that pastoral response? So he's a good example of a lay Catholic really responding with courage and grace at a very difficult time. And he's doing so against the backdrop of church leaders in New York who were actively opposing things that could have helped people with HIV and AIDS, opposing safe sex measures, fighting against public health campaigns, opposing LGBT civil rights laws. So there was this, I think, disconnect between what was happening on the ground, the priests, sisters, lay people engaged in this kind of work, and some church leaders who were, in the best cases, maybe torn about how do we proclaim traditional teaching while responding pastorally to a community in need, or simply weren't willing to engage with that community. So there is that dichotomy, and it's important to remember that, I think, as we consider the church's total response.
Right. What reaction to the book has been really most meaningful for you?
Yeah, there's been a lot of positive reaction, which has been heartening. Father John mentioned this letter from Pope Francis, so I was able to send the Pope a copy of the book and a letter over the summer. I wanted him to know about some of the people I wrote about for a couple of reasons. One, almost everyone I interviewed went out of their way to praise Pope Francis, to say how much they appreciated this space for dialogue about LGBT issues or difficult conversations in the church. And of course, Pope Francis wasn't the Pope 30 or 40 years ago when they were doing their work, and I think they were able to contrast the atmosphere in the church today with what they encountered back then. But I also thought it was interesting, Pope Francis talks a lot about the church as a field hospital, as kind of being out there with the wounded, with communities in need. And these people I write about in the book were doing just that 30 or 40 years ago. They're what we might call Pope Francis Catholics today. So I thought I should tell the Pope about these people and see what he has to say. So I sent a copy over, I sent a letter over. He wrote back and thanked me, which was very cool as a journalist to have my work kind of recognized. But the most moving part to me was being able to call some of the people I write about in the book and let them know that the Pope had written this letter back, that he knew about their stories, that he offered what I described as kind of a decades-late papal blessing on their work. And it moved many of the people I talked to, it moved some of them to tears, and it wasn't that they had been seeking validation from the institutional church. I think they were confident in their own work, but they felt seen. And the Pope's recognition that they had undertaken this work in this ministry at risk to their own reputations or vocations, that they had encountered some backlash from society, from the church, that was particularly powerful to them. So that was one reaction that was very cool. But I have to say, to me personally, it's when I encounter other people who don't remember this time firsthand, who didn't learn this history, because we don't do a good job of teaching LGBT history in schools, in our families, in our churches, for sure. So to be able to connect them with this time, to show them these models of faith, of Catholics who responded with love and mercy during difficult time, so that they don't feel alone like I did, that's been the most moving part to me. And it's happened over and over again as I go around the country talking about the book.
Well, thank you. Maybe we could open up this segment maybe to some questions or comments that people would like to offer to Michael at this time. If you would come up to the microphone here.
Thank you.
My friend Peter was died of AIDS, and he said to me, would you come to my funeral? And of course I said yes. He died that night, and we went to the Jesuit Urban Center, and I've been going there ever since. And I put together a little bit about a Sister Jeanette who worked at the Jesuit Urban Center and ran a home for women with AIDS in Cambridge. And unfortunately, she went to heaven in 2014. So I watched this little folder of information, and I just wanted to share the story. And
Thank you. Thanks.
That's great.
Thank you.
Jeanette is one of those giants, local ones.
Yeah, and that was something that kept happening during the research. Is I would interview one person, they would give me the names of 5 other people to talk to, but inevitably some of them had passed away and their stories hadn't been captured in any meaningful way yet. And even during the writing of the book, it became clear how urgent the reporting was to do now, because people are 30, 40 years on from this, and their stories risk being lost. So there is this urgency of capturing these stories now before we lose too many more.
That's right. That's right. And I also think folks who are watching this live stream have an opportunity to write in questions as well, right?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Mine's not so much a question, but more of like advice. Because I have like one of my closest friends is trans, male to female, and while she was transitioning, she once asked me, do you think God hates me? Which really hurt me because I felt so bad that my friend who was going through like the most complicated transition in her life, and which was really exciting for her really, but had to think in the back of her head that God hated her, and she's not even Christian, but the fact that she had to think about that was really upsetting to me. And all I could really say was, like, of course he does, he loves everyone, and I felt like I couldn't answer her question properly. And so how have you, as a gay and Catholic man, been able to know that God truly loves you? I just was wondering how I could better answer her question. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking that. And I've been thinking about the church's response to trans Catholics who are seeking a place in the church, who I think many are struggling with similar questions like your friend. And it's brought me back to a story in the book. So St. Vincents Hospital, this sort of legendary Catholic hospital in New York City that responded to HIV and AIDS in the 80s and 90s. And I had kind of known about St. Vincent's. I think a lot of people have heard of St. Vincent's. And it's tempting to take for granted that this Catholic hospital located in the middle of Greenwich Village with a large gay population right around would respond compassionately to the HIV and AIDS crisis. Like, it just makes sense that that would happen. But through my research, I learned that that wasn't the case. Early on, there were a lot of stumbles and missteps. Groups like ACT UP had targeted the hospital because there was some discrimination happening inside the hospital. Some staff didn't really know how to relate to the community. There was a lot of fear. And the Catholic Sisters, the Sisters of Charity of New York, who ran the hospital, instead of kind of like doubling down and saying like, no, we're doing the right thing, we're providing the care that people need, they said something's wrong here. Like, the fact that people don't feel welcome shows that we're not hearing something, we're not responding in a way that makes sense to them. So let's listen. Instead of sort of responding to the protests in a way that would push people away, they actually invited the protesters in and said, tell us what's going on, how can we do a better job? And as a result, over the next couple of years, it really did transform into a place where the LGBT community felt welcome, where the church was still very much a presence. So there wasn't necessarily the tension that there might have been had they decided not to show humility and ask, how can we do a better job? And I see a similar dynamic playing out today, where I think there's a temptation among some church leaders to sort of double down and say, here's church teaching on gender and sexuality, and as a result, some of those statements are getting across that perpetuate the hurt that your friend expressed. I think if we as a church did better in listening to questions and comments from your friends, people like your friend, and considering how might our response look better so that those kinds of hurtful feelings aren't experienced in the first place. I think the listening component has been lost in this. So I hope that people like your friend do feel more comfortable sharing their stories, because that's the only way I think we as a church will be better in responding in the future.
Hi, Michael.
I'm reminded of, you possibly know John McNeil, the Jesuit, and I'm reminded of two stories as he had to leave because he was silenced by the church, and he went on to live an extraordinary life in many, many ways. But the two stories that I remember from his passing was he, in his room that he had on his door, priest John McNeil. Now, he had been out of the church for many, many years, but the biggest moment of difficulty and pain in his life, his partner Charlie said to me, was that John would not be buried with his brothers as a Jesuit. So, I think the story that we hear, often we hear good stories which are wonderful, but oftentimes there's still a lot of things that don't get acknowledged, I think, in the church. And it's just to remind that, there were extraordinary people that did amazing work, but I think John is somebody I think of often, that he was quite, his life was testimony to extraordinary pain and sacrifice that he gave.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Father John McNeil was a name that kept coming up throughout my research. People who were moved by his ministry. Something that has stuck with me through the research, again, kind of going back to St. Vincent's, going back to a place like Most Holy Redeemer Parish in San Francisco, this parish right in the middle of the Castro that's incredibly welcoming to the LGBT community. Again, this notion that these things are inevitable, that these spaces that we, like Saint Cecilia's, that we kind of take for granted today, at least people maybe my age and younger, that there are these LGBT-friendly spaces in the church, they just exist. Well, I've learned through the benefit of reporting and interviews that nothing is inevitable. Nothing friendly to LGBT people is inevitable. And the work of people like Father McNeil and others who really suffered as a result of their early prophetic ministry is essential to be collected and remembered. So thank you for raising that point. Even though I tend to, especially tonight at this talk, focus on some of the more positive examples of Catholics doing the right thing, there was a lot of pain inflicted by the institution on people who were really calling the church to live out its own values. So thank you for bringing that up. And thank you to everyone standing up to ask questions. I know it's not always easy to go to a microphone, so I appreciate it.
Hi, Michael. My name is Martha, and I am a master's student in public health at Boston University. And I got your book for Christmas, so I'm really excited to be talking to you here. But I'm just curious, as a Catholic, I'm studying public health, and I know that you did all of this investigation on this public health crisis in the 80s and 90s, and we have this heightened awareness about public health in our world today due to the COVID pandemic, and also, all of these other public health epidemics and reproductive health and the drug problem in our country and all of these other things. And I'm just curious if you had any themes that you learned in your journalism that you think could be widely applied to other public health problems, and what a good Catholic response could be to all of the public health crises in our country and our world.
Yeah, thank you. And good luck with your studies. You're certainly entering the field at a unique time in history, so thank you for your willingness to do that. It's important work. It's been interesting. When I started this project back in 2018, I certainly wasn't imagining that most of my writing and reporting would happen in the middle of another global public health crisis. Most of the book was written in the summer of 2020. It was an amazing opportunity to be able to interview Dr. Anthony Fauci about his own role during HIV and AIDS, about how his faith influenced his work at the time. And I think I'll sort of defer to him and what he told me about kind of the intersection of his faith with the public health crisis, two of them now. And his sort of main takeaway was, again, this insistence that we listen to communities most in need. So whether it's people afflicted by HIV and AIDS, communities affected by HIV and AIDS in the 80s and 90s, communities disproportionately impacted by COVID today, what are the challenges there? And what I've learned from the Catholic sisters I've interviewed who were engaged deeply in HIV and AIDS work was it takes a lot of humility to listen, especially if what you're hearing is not always complimentary, if you're being challenged, like maybe you're not doing something right, or we don't feel we're being served well by this institution. So that deep humility that I think comes from a deep faith is a lesson that I think everyone can benefit from, but even people in public health, sort of that sense that we don't have all the answers, that people living their lives might have something to teach us. So that was a big takeaway from the sisters and from the public health people I interviewed for the book. Thanks.
Hi, Michael. I have a couple of questions from folks who are joining us from online. Mark Brown from Philly would like to know, what was the most challenging part of writing this book for you?
The most challenging part of writing the book for me? That's a good question. So a lot of the questions I have kind of good answers to because I've been asked them a few times. The most challenging part, that's an interesting question. There's a lot of unresolved trauma from this time. Some of the interviews I would do, people were very generous with their time. We would spend hours and hours on the phone or in person. But inevitably, I was asking many people to go back decades and kind of open up places in their heart that haven't been revealed in many decades. And it was very difficult for many people. I think there's a lot of unresolved trauma, a lot of attempts to kind of block out that point in history. When I was in San Francisco a few weeks ago giving a book talk, I was with someone who was telling me about how he had moved to LA as a young man. It was sort of an attempt to be able to live his life authentically as a gay man. He had moved away and come out and formed this great friendship community. And he said that over the course of just a few years, he said that there were 14 guys who were part of this regular crew. 12 of them had passed away from age-related complications. And his story is not unique. I've heard this a few times. And he said now that he's aging, he's in his 60s, 70s, he doesn't have those kind of friendships, those decades-long friendships that I think a lot of people take comfort in as they confront some of this. And just the trauma that he was experiencing, kind of relaying these stories to me, weighed heavily on me. And knowing that all I could do was listen, and I benefit from his sharing his experience with me, but it became heavy after a while, for years and years listening to these stories. And it was an opportunity and a great blessing for me to be able to do this work, but there is a lot of heaviness in these stories.
Thank you. Another from Zoom, this one from Elliot Barnhill. How do you hold the tension between the acceptance and radical hospitality of the LGBT plus friendly Catholic spaces and the hostility of church leadership? How do you decide who represents the church?
So the balancing the tension between sort of the radical hospitality of some communities and some church leaders who don't seem as intent on the welcoming aspect of the church, and what is the real church? I think that's the gist of the question. Yeah, it's a good question. Over the weekend, I was in Atlanta meeting with a group of parents of LGBT children, and sort of various levels of acceptance, some angry at the church for pushing their child out of the church, some committed to the church and trying to figure out how do they love their children, even though they don't agree with decisions that their child has made. And it was at that gathering that I got this real understanding that this is an issue that affects families. This isn't sort of a theoretical or abstract problem. This is something that's affecting families. And in the book, I try to cover lots of different responses to this. So some people I interviewed in the book grew up in very Catholic families, and then when they realized that it wasn't a good fit for them anymore, that it wasn't healthy for them to remain, they simply walked away. And I think that's probably the right choice for some people even today. Other people kind of stay and fight. So I interviewed members of Dignity who, when they were kicked out of parishes around the country, decided to protest, and they went to the cardinals' masses and stood up and turned their backs during the homily. And when that didn't work, they kind of stayed and they tried to make changes in the church. Other people find a supportive community somewhere like here and kind of ignore the rest of it. I interviewed a guy named Michael DeSalvo in Syracuse. He and his partner Nick turned their house into a Catholic worker home for people with HIV and AIDS in the 1990s. And when I asked him how he reconciled it, he kind of looked at me quizzically and said, well, I know God loves me, the rest is, I just don't pay attention to it. Like, that's just how it works. So all these different responses. For me, it's sort of, if you ask me, depending on the what's going on in the news and what I'm writing about, that might affect it. There's, I think, an example in the book where a documentary that came out a few years ago in which there was video footage of the Pope expressing support for same-sex civil unions. It was kind of this exciting moment for the LGBT Catholic community that felt like, oh, maybe there's some possibilities here. But then a few months later, the Vatican came out with a document reminding priests that they cannot do this, using kind of particularly harsh language that God cannot bless sin. So sort of this up and down. I interview LGBT people who are fired from their jobs in parishes or schools after their marriages are made public, but also LGBT people who are leading wonderful ministries in parishes across the country. So I think my bias tends to be gravitating toward the more positive examples of how LGBT people of faith are making it work in the church. But I think there is a struggle there. So each individual has to kind of figure out what's right for them and go from there. But I think once you make the decision that you're going to remain part of the institution, I think steeling yourself for some of the challenges ahead is essential, because there will be some.
Hi, my name is Pat, and I want to thank you for being here and for that wonderful book. I read it last week. I hope I don't burst into tears tonight, because I had tears throughout the entire reading. I'm a nurse. I was a palliative care nurse during the HIV issues, late 80s, well into the 90s, and was the director of client services at the AIDS Action Committee. So it brought back so many incredible, beautiful memories. I love the fact that you did not mince your words, that you told the truth about the sorrow of this church and its poor response. But as you said, the hidden mercies, so many wonderful people who did come forward, because that's what kept me grounded as I did this work, because I'm Catholic. I went to the Jesuit Urban Center. I was crushed when it closed. But the one thing that I remember when I was trying to struggle whether or not, here I am, like straight woman, I got 5 kids, a husband, I lived in the burbs, so I felt very privileged, but my colleagues were really struggling. I remember one day being in the hallway at the AIDS Action Committee, and I had left the Urban Center after it had closed, and people were really very upset, but committed to the church. They were going nowhere. And I was in the hallway in the staircase with a colleague, and I said, how do you remain Catholic in the midst of all this? How do you do that? He looked at me and he said, this church will not define me. I am going to fight the good fight and help redefine the church. And that has resonated with me through years, and I heard it over and over again in your book. So thank you very much.
No, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for your own work. I imagine a lot of stories from that time. Yeah. So probably one more question.
Hello, it's not a question, it's more of just a statement. I really love the book, and I really love the Plague podcast too, and I listened to it when I was living in Seattle, and I was sharing the episodes with my spiritual director, who was a Sister of Providence out there, and she was telling me the history about how the Sisters of Providence started the first AIDS support group in Seattle, and they served women who were HIV positive and who had AIDS too. But I also found some of the stories very inspiring too. I'm someone who is discerning religious life, and I'm actually a pre-postulant with the Felician Sisters.
Nice.
And just hearing the stories of the religious sisters who worked at St. Vincent's and Sister Carol, and all those were inspiring. And then also Father Bill McNichols' story, who I didn't really know beforehand, and for me, I'm always trying to find other people who are out in religious life, and it's I don't know, and I'm hearing those stories and finding courage in that and stuff like that. So I found that very inspiring. So I just wanted to share that. So.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. No, and good luck on your journey with discernment.
Michael, on the cover the sleeve of the book, there's one piece here that's just, I just want to read. It's very moving about what you write. This is one gay Catholic journalist's compelling picture of those quiet heroes who responded to human suffering when so much of society and so much of the church told them to look away. These pure acts of compassion and mercy offer us hope and inspiration as we continue to confront existential questions about what it means to be Americans, Christians, and human beings responding to those most in need. I believe that you're one of those quiet heroes, and my fear would be that we would, or the future would forget what happened during the 80s and the 90s and during the crisis of AIDS, and I believe that this is one work that will help us not to forget. And the other thing I'm feeling really strongly tonight is I feel like the Urban Center didn't close, and so thank you, John, for what you did to welcome that community here, so thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming here. I'll be around in the back. Thank you.
Just in closing, a couple of quick comments. Terry, having known you over these past couple of years, I had no idea that your brother died from HIV/AIDS in 1990, and just to kind of hear that, and for the first time, just how personal things are for all of us, and it's when we tell those stories that I think we come together, we become not just empathetic, but we walk together, and it's healing. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for facilitating so beautifully, so well, and for interviewing so well too. Thank you. Really good. Thank you for your questions, your comments, your observations. Olivia, you get up there and ask the big question. If you ask me, does God love us, whoever us is, any one of us as human beings? And there's so much in the world that militates against that, and it's about keeping that question alive and keeping that answer alive. Michael, I think you're just doing a beautiful job with this, so you keep asking those questions, because if you're asking them now in that way on behalf of your friends, can't wait to see who you'll be when you get to be our ripe old age, all right? I especially, Mellon, want to thank you and the Rainbow Ministry. Charlie, Jim, Michael, just the whole crew. Just thank you for all the work that you do and all the ministry that you do here in this parish. It's so often behind the scenes, but then it allows something like this evening to happen in such a wonderful way, so thank you. I'll call your attention, I'm landing the plane, believe it or not. There's a beautiful bookcase on the right-hand side of the church, and for those who are watching at home, you're not going to be able to see this necessarily, but when we took the kids out on a service learning experience, Young Neighbors in Action, we were out in Gallup, New Mexico, and so when we came back, took the kids into Taos and Santa Fe, and we went to this church in South Taos, I think, or Rancho de Taos. Anyway, Bill McNichols was there, and he was painting, and went into his studio in this whole area. And so we have a painting, and it was Matthew Shepard after he was just brutally tortured and killed, and that painting of his is out back. So that's a great gift. So. Anyway, thank you, everyone, for you guys doing such a great job with the live stream, for all of the input that came from here in the house and virtually. And Michael, thank you for this book. We really encourage you to get Hidden Mercy. Michael will sign a few of these out back, right? Yep. And you can always look it up on the Google and get it on the Amazon, right?
Absolutely.
All right. So thank you, everybody. Thanks.